Let's get started. Hello and welcome to our program, How to Photograph Artwork with Blaine Campbell, co-presented by Art Gallery of Alberta and CARFAC Alberta. My name is Michael Magnuson. I am the public programmer at the Art Gallery of Alberta. To start this program, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. This land on which we are situated is part of Treaty 6 territory, where Indigenous peoples have been making and creating since time immemorial. These are the ancestral and traditional lands of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and Métis. We acknowledge and extend gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations and who continue to call this place home today. We are, of course, privileged in this digital realm to gather together from multiple places. So I encourage any of you who do not share these same lands with us to take a moment to acknowledge the people of the land on which you are situated and tuning in from. Before we get started, I would like to mention a few events that are happening at the Art Gallery of Alberta in June. We are celebrating Pride Month with two programs, a film night on June 9th, where we are screening the camp classic, But I'm a Cheerleader at 6 p.m. and the Oscar-winning film Moonlight at 8 p.m. We are also hosting a full day of celebrations at the gallery called Pride Day at the AGA, which features a great day of activities, drag, film screenings on June 18th. June is also Indigenous History Month, and we are opening the gallery on June 21st for a free day at the gallery in recognition of National Indigenous Peoples Day from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. For full information, please visit our website. I would also like to mention that we are hosting our first art party called Refinery on July 22nd. Early bird tickets are only $25 and are available for another week. So please visit our website for all that information as well. This is a virtual program and will last 1 hour roughly with a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom and we will answer them at the end. Also, I would like to thank our sponsor, the Canada Council for the Arts, for sponsoring this program. And without further delay, I'm going to pass this off to Chris, our partner at CARFAC Alberta. Chris, take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael, and the AGA for partnering with CARFAC Alberta on this session that will teach all of us how to take a few better pictures of our art. So I am Chris Carson, the Executive Director of CARFAC Alberta. CARFAC Alberta is the provincial arts service organization that serves visual artists. We work to advance best practices for all visual artists through education, advocacy, and engagement. CARFAC Alberta envisions a province where all visual artists can thrive, where artwork is valued, rights are respected, and creativity is integral to our communities. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to Blaine Campbell. He's an Alberta-based artist working both in photography, sculpture, and video. And as an artist, his thematic interests have included the inherent properties of the photograph and its relation to the viewer, landscape use and modification, processes of meditation, and artifice in relation to transcendent experience and parallels between Jacques Diderot's textuality and quantum theory. As a commercial photographer, Blaine divides his time between Edmonton and Vancouver, and as a commercial photographic services are primarily centered in architecture and fine art documentation, working with architectural and construction firms, museums, and galleries. Clients in the past have included the Art Gallery of Alberta, the Remy Collection, TransLink, City of Vancouver, Art Speak, Simon Fraser University Galleries, the Museum of Anthropology, Burnaby Art Gallery, the Remy Modern, amongst others. So today we have a real expert with us to kind of share and kind of teach us a little bit more. As Michael kind of mentioned, it's I would suggest that we kind of save our chat. You can save the chat by just going into the chat, clicking on those kind of three little dots after the chat and saving it, because there is this document that Blaine Campbell has placed in it that probably teaches you a lot of what he's going to show you tonight. But so really make sure you save and download this PDF document that Blaine has for you, okay? And write down your questions. And without further ado, Blaine, please take it away, and thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Chris. And thanks everybody else for coming. Hopefully this will be of some value to you. It's going to be very rushed, admittedly. It's a very short amount of time to cover a lot of potentially technical material. So I'm going to try to touch on a few key points, things that I think will generally improve the quality of what you're getting in terms of your art documentation. I'm going to demo stuff a little bit. That's going to be a little bit clunky over Zoom, but hopefully I won't make anybody too motion sick with my cell phone demoing stuff. And then we'll wrap up going into a little bit of editing on one image, just to give you an idea of how you can sort of improve things after the fact, taking the pictures. So the one thing I'd really recommend, and I put this together years ago and have updated it periodically since, I put together this PDF covering a few key points and things to consider. Again, very introductory. There's photography as a profession. There's a ton of technical material that can feed into it and change how things come out. But hopefully this document is of some value to you. So I've posted it in the chat as the first item, and then we'll maybe reshared it again at the end, just in case you can't find it. So having said all that, I'm going to jump in with my cell phone, and we'll walk through a little bit of a setup and a few key points, things to consider when you are shooting. And then, as I say, we'll go into the edit. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second here, I'm going to switch to my phone. Okay. And see if this works. Switch to my camera. Okay. So we'll focus through how kind of a general setup, and then I'll touch on a few things as we go. So as I say, and I'm gonna, the awkward part of this is I'm set up in my dining room. So I guess the first key point is to try to find a location that is of value to you in terms of where you can place your artwork, ideally somewhere fairly clean. So I've kind of set up 3 little stations here with ostensibly 3 pieces of art, including a teddy bear, which is standing in for a sculpture at this point. The key point I would say when you are trying to shoot stuff is try to find somewhere as clean as you can, free of distractions. The goal ideally with artwork documentation is to make sure the artwork really stands out in a very clean environment. So we don't want paint splatters on the wall, holes in the wall if we can avoid it, electrical outlets. All that stuff can be edited out after the fact, but it also takes a lot of time to do that editing. So the cleaner you can keep it, the better. So a nice blank wall for 2D work. And then if you're doing 3D work, a very easy improvisation is a couple of inexpensive stands that you can get off of Amazon and a piece of white paper. The white paper is called Seamless. It's relatively inexpensive. You can get it from any of the major camera stores, VizTech or McBain in particular. And a roll of 4 foot wide by about 30 feet is around $45. It's generally one use. It gets dirty and you don't want to have to Photoshop all debris, but extremely useful in creating a very clean environment to place sculpture in. Okay? So that's the key idea around location. The next thing I want to touch on with it is lighting. So I've set up some very inexpensive lights. These are kind of pot reflectors. Again, not that expensive. And I've put LED bulbs inside that I got from the dollar store. The brighter the bulbs you can get, the better. So these are 100-watt equivalent LED bulbs. Oh, hopefully my lights. There we go. Okay. The brighter the better in general. The value in using these reflectors, and again, these are the sort of things you can get on Amazon relatively inexpensively. The value of the reflector is it will concentrate some of that light and put it more focused on the artwork. The other improvisation I've added is to diffuse the light in some way. So if we don't have a diffuser, I apologize for Zoom level demoing, it's a little awkward. If I take the diffuser off of this, I get very hard shadows, as you can, if we kind of zoom in here. If we have some kind of diffusion on it, so I'm trying to use 2 hands and hold the phone. Sorry, everybody. With some sort of a diffusion, that softens the shadows out and kind of evens things to some extent. And in this case, again, keeping in mind that I'm assuming everybody is not running out to buy professional photo gear. I've literally just used parchment paper and a couple of binder clips to create that diffusion. So it's possible to set up a fairly reasonable shooting environment without spending a ton of money. Okay. So one other thing I'll mention about the lighting as well in terms of where you're shooting. The ideal case in this instance, my dining room is not a great shooting environment, especially because I've got windows all over the place that are bringing in sunlight. So if I really had to document work that was critical in this environment, I would be looking to either completely block out the windows so that I can fully control the sunlight coming in, or wait until dusk, twilight later, so I'm not getting a lot of sun coming in and I can just rely on my own lighting. Okay, in terms of setting up your lights, the long standard, I'm just going to back this up a little bit. The usual standard for work that is 2D and very flat is to set the lights up roughly 45 to each side and equidistant. This is especially true if you're looking to close crop the work. So if I was documenting this piece and my intention was to actually cut out the piece in the final photograph and not have any wall, then this sort of lighting setup tends to work really well because you can get a fairly even distribution of light. And we're not worried about what sort of shadows we're getting cast by the work. That being said, if we do want shadows, which can be quite useful in terms of showing the depth of a piece, then we may not want to put lights at the sides. We may actually want to rack them higher up. So I'm going to attempt to do this really quickly. I'll just put my phone down. Okay, so coming back to this, so I've simply raised the lights up higher, again keeping it to the sides, but by doing so I've got, now looking at the work, I've got some sense of the shadow underneath it. There'll be 2 lesser shadows on each side that won't be as strong, but the main one is the shadow on the bottom. that kind of gives a sense of the work being in a space. Okay. The same idea applies especially to any kind of dimensional work that is on the wall. So paintings with impasto or relevant brushwork, or even if you want to actually show texture in the canvas, then racking the lights higher up can be quite helpful for that, because you'll cast shadows downward on the work. So here's our improvised impasto piece. So by having the lights coming in from above, we will actually cast shadows downward and pick up some sense of the texture within the piece by lighting it from above, and again, getting some feel of dimensionality to it. So those are sort of the key takeaways I give in terms of setting up your lights. And I would encourage you, when you do set them up, to experiment a bit with moving the lights around, seeing where the shadows are going, where the highlights are going, and being aware of how they affect the work. So conveniently with this black piece, this is also a consideration. So black paint, black surfaces in particular, tend to pick up a lot of highlight. So the blacks don't stay black, they become kind of shiny and dull. So this is also a consideration once you're trying to line things up, and we can see this a bit in this arrangement. As I move this light around, I'm not getting true blacks in there, I'm getting some reflection from the light. So,
And Blaine, you know, you can't, the people can't see what you're taking on your phone right now.
oh, really?
Yeah, so you have to turn that back on.
Okay, according to my Zoom, I'm still doing that. Now it's saying I'm not. Okay, apologies everybody. I had sharing on.
That's fine now. That's perfect.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. That wonders of Zoom technology. So, okay, I'll try that again. So, once you have the light set up, look at how the photo is going to work, and then experiment with moving the lights around to see how it actually affects the piece. So, as I was trying to say, or trying to show, with black surfaces in particular, or anything with a lot of gloss, like oil paints, they will tend to pick up lights and reflect them back in ways you may not expect. So this piece is fairly flat, matte black, but it still will reflect the lights as I move them around, depending on where the camera is placed and where the light is placed. So once you have some sense of things, move those lights around and just see where you can get to try to even things out. And I can only go so far in this demo. And again, also because I've got windows in this room that are not covered, they're going to affect things a little bit too. Okay. So next thing I'm going to encourage you to do, apart from the lighting now, is in terms of the actual shooting, try to pay as much attention as you can to composition. The goal is really to kind of keep things nicely lined up and as square as you can, especially if you're working with 2D work like paintings or photographs that are already inherently rectangular. It would be nice if the photo is rectangular too. I've seen a lot of work over the years, a lot of images over the years of paintings where if things are off perspective, like that is not a really flattering view of the work because it's rather distorted. So try to line things up as best you can. For this, having grid lines on your camera turned on are quite helpful because it gives you a visual reference to try to find those square points. so that when you do line it up, you can get things fairly straight and avoid having to do a lot of editing after the fact. The next thing is like how much space to give to work. And this is where I'm keeping this talk centered on using smartphones, just because my assumption is most people are not going to be running out to buy a camera to do this. You have to kind of keep in mind that camera phones are designed for more so for taking pictures of people or groups of people. So the lenses tend to be quite wide and a bit distorted. So you will have to get fairly close to the work to keep it in frame and not wasting a lot of space. So I could shoot it out from here. I'll get an image that we find to use in, say, social media or on web pages once I crop it. But there's a lot of wasted white space here. There's no point in doing that. I may as well bring it in nice and close. I wouldn't crop right into the work when taking the photo. I'd be kind of in this range. That gives me a bit of space to work with when I go to edit it. The other consideration with using cell phone cameras, again, because they're quite wide, this is not so much an issue with 2D work, but with 3D work. So we'll use our improvised sculpture here. Is that when you're shooting with a cell phone camera, because it is very wide, it will distort the closer you get. So I have to be quite close to the bear to get it photographed in this way. So as the closer I get, the more kind of visual distortion there is. And on my phone, if I actually switch to the wide angle lens, then that distortion gets quite predominant. So it's just something to keep in mind when shooting with a cell phone. And the alternative, of course, is to zoom in to try to reduce some of that. The difficulty with zooming in with a cell phone is that the lenses are not actually zooming. It's just the camera is cutting out part of the image. So I could zoom in a lot, but the more I zoom in, the less resolution I will actually have, and the noisier the image is going to be in the end result. So my suggestion is don't bother zooming in. Just use the lens as it is, and more or less get what you can with it, I suppose. Okay. One other thing I want to mention, I'm focusing very much on just documenting digital artwork, but something I see a lot is in terms of kind of wider pictures. We'll just flip this. So say I'm shooting a gallery installation or an exhibition. Let's say this is my gallery installation. Again, really pay attention to perspective as you're shooting it. It doesn't take a whole lot, but just kind of slowing down a little bit and watching for how you can get things nice and square will do a lot to make the image look much more professional when you go to use it or submit it. So finding those vertical elements and keeping them truly vertical really tends to make an image stand out and just look a little more finished. Okay, sorry, I'm probably zooming through a lot of stuff here, but let's just see where we're at. Okay, in terms of actually taking the picture now, again, with a cell phone, you're a little bit limited in terms of how much functionality you have. That being said, most of them have some controls at this point. So the two things I really wanted to mention around that is that cameras tend to be fooled quite a bit in terms of figuring out what will make a good picture in terms of the exposure. So cameras will traditionally attempt to make everything an even gray tone. So in this scene, it's the camera's assessing things, trying to mix in this white stuff and this black stuff and all the other elements and averaging them out to being what's called 18% gray. That approach tends to work really well for the majority of situations. But if you are working with things with a lot of black, a lot of dark brown, or conversely, a lot of white, the camera will be a bit confused by that. And so if I'm looking at documenting this work, all this black is actually starting to be pushed. We'll kind of ignore this reflection for the moment, but some of the blacks are not really coming out as black. They're going to come out starting to look more gray. So let's see if I can do it on here. So it's worthwhile familiarizing yourself a little bit with your camera controls. And on my iPhone, I can actually force the camera to adjust the exposure a little bit and try to get the blacks looking a little more black. Again, we've got this reflection issue. I want to kind of clarify that or fix that before I actually take the picture. But assuming it was okay, I can adjust the exposure some to try to get the tones looking more correct. The flip side of this is if I was, say, doing an installation shot at an exhibition, most of this frame is now a white wall. And so the camera will be confused by all that white, and it will try to push that white into being a gray as well. So in that instance, I want to do the opposite. I want to overexpose a bit. That will make those whites more truly white and less gray. And also, again, save me some work after the fact in editing. So that's the key idea in terms of trying to tweak the exposure if you feel you need to. Okay, one more thing I wanted to say about taking your actual photos. And that is that your camera can also be confused about what is an appropriate color. So if you are shooting close to something, let's say we go over to this one. Let's say I was taking this detail of the work. There's a lot of yellow in this brass. That may confuse the camera's sense of color. And it may push the colors in the wrong direction. That's where the idea of white balancing comes in. So if you can include an element that is what you would consider truly white, that can be used after the fact to clean it up in editing. So conveniently here we've got some white wall, which we can treat as white. If we didn't have that, let's say I was going into this piece to do detail, I might want to consider including a very small element of white. So in this case, I'm just using a piece of folded over office paper. If I include that in the frame, just enough that I can see it, I'll use that in editing later and then crop it out. So it does reduce things a little bit in terms of I'm gonna have to throw away part of the picture. But it will give me something that's truly white that I can reference later during the editing stage to try to correct for color. Okay. If you get really serious about it, you can move into using something more thorough. Something like this is a color chart. These are standardized and can be used to further reference correct colors. I wouldn't necessarily encourage doing that off the bat. It's a much more involved process and also not a cheap way to go. Those cards are now about $150 a piece. But if you can at least use just a bit of white paper, even that will help correct colors quite a bit. Also the case to consider if you're doing installation photography of larger exhibitions, having some element of true white in the photo will help you correct the colors later. That's very much an issue I find in a lot of gallery settings where they have a mix of, as we have here right now, a mix of windows, a mix of different kinds of overhead lighting. Some galleries might have fluorescents and spotlights and natural light. All of those lights have different forms of color attached to them that will affect how the color of the work is rendered. So if you can get those white point references in the images, you can use that after the fact to sort of correct for things. Okay, those were the key things that I wanted to sort of rush through in terms of setting up things to take pictures and a few points to consider in terms of using your phone to do so. I'm going to switch over. I'm going to put this one down. I'll switch over to my computer now. Okay, so let's say we have a photo that we've now taken. We've done what we can to try to correct things as best we can in terms of setting the lights up, setting the work up, using the settings in the camera. Invariably, there will still be some tweaks to do after the fact, and that's where having an editing process or what we call a post-production workflow can also be helpful, just to, again, get images into their very final state and looking their absolute best, again, to make the artwork stand out its best, as best it can. So I'm going to jump through into a editing program. Let's see how this will work now. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see my screen now. Right, again, Zoom issues here. Okay, so this will be the cooking show example where I've sort of set something up previously, and we'll just walk through trying to fix it a little bit. And I'm going to do this in a program called Affinity. It's a very inexpensive replacement for Photoshop. I myself tend to work in Photoshop, Lightroom, Capture One. These are more, say, professional level editing programs, but also more expensive. So I wouldn't encourage you to run out and buy these things just to do a bit of documentation. Affinity, on the other hand, very expensive. I think it's $70 right now, and quite regularly they put it on sale for $35. Another alternative that I just came across is an online editor called Photopea. That's free, a very good knockoff as far as I can tell of what Photoshop can do. So I'd encourage looking at those as options, especially Photopea being free. It's a good way to go about things. So let's say we have this this image of this artwork, and we want to get it into its final state to, say, send it off for submission or put it in a portfolio. I'm going to jump through a few small things to do in here that will just make it look that much better. So it's not bad right now, but you'll see like it's not quite square. The edges, there's a little bit of distortion to it. It's a little bit flat and dull. It would be nice if we get it into a state that makes it look a little better. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of fix that distortion that's in here. So in Affinity, we can drag out little lines to see where things are at. So we can see by putting the straight lines that it is indeed not quite square. Most photo editing tools will have some sort of distortion correction or perspective correction tool. Your phone will have that too. The phone ones tend to be a little bit limited. If you need, I mean, if you don't have any other choice, that's will help correct things. But software, you can go take things much further. So in Affinity, they have a perspective tool. In Photoshop, they have an edit distortion transform. Photopea is something similar. And the idea is things you can grab corners and just start to correct for, oh, sorry, I don't have the right thing selected. There we go. So we can pull the corners into a shape that is actually square. Seems like a minor thing, but if we go back to where it was to where it's corrected, there is a visual difference that makes it just look that much better and that much more finished. Okay, so I've got a perspective correction. I'm going to throw in a couple other things. So I mentioned trying to photograph something white in a scene. So you have a color reference point. And again, most photo editing tools will have some form of way to correct for the white balance. Sorry, I just have to find it in here now. So if I, and again, in Infinity, if I turn on the white balance tool in here, I can go in and use something to pick that, what I want to treat as pure white. And I'll say that the wall is my pure white. And if I select that, the tool will shift the colors to make that selection to be what is considered white. If I'm not quite happy with it, I've got ways of kind of moving the color around to get something that I'm happier with. And let's say that is where I want to make it as what I consider true white. That little change is not big, but again, it will push all the other colors within the artwork to be closer to what they really are. I will say one of the big difficulties with photographing artwork is color reproduction is very tricky. Do keep that in mind as you look at your work. What you see on your phone screen versus what is on the wall or on a plinth will not necessarily match up. And going from your phone to your computer may not match up, and going from your computer to, say, a catalog or book will not necessarily match up. That whole workflow tends to be very complicated and very involved and well beyond what we can get into today. So you have to just kind of use little tricks as best you can. And so the white balance is one way to do that, to at least get things closer to what they are. I'd also mention, just to keep in mind as well, that you don't know what other people are looking at in terms of when they look at your art on their screen, what state their screen is in, how old it is, if it's too bright or not bright enough. A lot of factors that will go into affecting how things look. But we'll do the best we can. So we have a distortion correction, we have a white balance correction. We'll also add in an exposure correction for this one. So the whites aren't bad, but they're not white. And again, this is a problem with the camera. May choose to underexpose or overexpose compared to what's actually occurring in the scene. So I'm just going to add in another element here, an exposure adjustment to brighten things up a little bit. Okay, that's making things pop a little nicer. So the whites are actually looking more white. You can take this further, and this is getting a little more advanced. Sorry, I have to do a couple little clicks here. So we've brought the white up here closer to what we're going to consider a true white. We don't want to go overboard with that white, but we do want it to make it brighter. But because of the way it was lit with the lights up high, this white is more white than the bottom white. It's the bottom white's still looking a bit gray. So we can get into adding things like a little more exposure adjustment, where we may want to brighten it up a bit more, but we don't want all of it to be too white, so we add something called a mask. Oh, sorry, I did that the wrong direction. I want that to be on the bottom. So if we turn this off and on, we can see that the bottom part of the picture is getting brighter and the top part is being left alone. I won't go into the details of that. It's just something that if you want to get really picky about how even your lighting is, understanding things like exposure adjustments and particularly masking or gradient tools are super helpful for taking that extra step. And I'll throw one more thing into here on this image. We can add other things like, let's say, a level. And a level can be used to shift the highlights and the darks around. So I'm just going to add this level adjustment in. That will push the blacks into being more black. So all told, we had our original image and then all these other things we've thrown on top. And that is getting fairly close to what the artwork looks like, more or less. One last thing I'd suggest too is cropping things after the fact. Don't just stick with whatever shape your camera gives you. If the work is square, then crop it to being square. So it actually kind of matches. And again, it has that more sort of finished look to it. Okay, I think that's more or less what I wanted to cover today. Okay. I was very rushed. And I apologize if I've kind of jumped over a lot of stuff too quickly for anybody, but hopefully we can address some of those things in the Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, do you want to come back on the screen and we can start the Q&A? Great. Well, thank you so much for that lovely presentation. I'm just going to remind everyone to put their questions in the chat or in the Q&A function. I don't see anything just yet. So we'll just give everyone a second.
So Blaine, somebody had a question about whether you should be saving in RAW or you're working in JPEG. What were you working in when you were doing these images?
So when I'm shooting professionally, I'm shooting everything in RAW. And if you have a camera capable of shooting in RAW, I would encourage you to do so. The ideal aspect of RAW format is it saves exactly what the camera sees. The downside of that process is you have to take those RAW files and then actually edit them after the fact. So there's more work involved, but it gives you the best quality result to work with. The downside with shooting in, say, JPEG setting on a dedicated camera is that tends to shift a lot of the decision making in terms of color exposure and whatnot is made in the camera. The camera is making the decisions for you, and then it is saving it out in a way that is more difficult to correct for after the fact if you need to. So the RAW version lets you just take more or less the raw light, so to speak, that was recorded, and then you go through and make all the changes after the fact as much as you want. So there's a key advantage in that, but it is more involved as a process. You actually asked too in terms of what I was just doing with the edit. That picture was taken with my cell phone.
Okay.
So that on Apple, they have something called the HEIC format. It's kind of raw, but kind of not. There's still a lot of decisions being made by the phone in terms of how it's recording things. So it's not quite as flexible as a true raw format as you might like, but that's the sort of limitation you're stuck with in that case.
Great. I have a question from the chat here. It's from, the question is, when shooting art, is it common to leave a background around the image or edit so only the art piece is showing? Do you think, is it up to personal preference, or what do you think?
It varies a little bit. I'd say the majority of the time there is some background allowed into it, especially if the work is framed. It may be necessary to actually show what that form of framing is. So it is common to leave some band around it, and my personal preference is usually leave a bit of band, and often I weight it a little more so there's a bit more on the bottom to actually see the shadow, because again that shadow will give you, for 2D work, it give you a sense of the depth of the work, but you're straight on, so you don't, otherwise you don't get it. The flip side is I just documented a bunch of paintings in Vancouver this past week. And the canvases weren't mounted all that great with those paintings. So there's a lot of kind of raw edge, which wasn't, I don't think was well, I know it wasn't the intention of the artist to leave those raw edges in. They just had not had a chance to actually get to the framing stage with them. So in that case, I shot it as close as I could, but still leaving a bit of room on the edges during the photography. And then in the editing stage, they were close cropped. So it was only the painting and there's no wall in that case.
Interesting.
Yeah. Overall, I'd say when you're photographing, do leave some space. And that space is a bit of a safety margin, especially if things, as I was showing, are not quite square and you need to correct for some distortions. If you have that safety margin in, there is then room for the geometry to kind of shift around without losing any of the work in the process.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have another question?
Yeah, Blaine, I've got a question from the chat, and that's, would you recommend the use of a tripod even when you're using your cell phone, or do you, yeah, what would you suggest with tripods?
I would definitely recommend the tripod as much as you can. I'm certainly, I use a tripod all the time, but I'm also not taking pictures with cell phones. So a tripod for a cell phone is trickier to even to find. I guess there are ways of doing that with cell phone holders, but yeah, if you can figure out a way to use a tripod if you are shooting on a cell phone, do it. And if you're shooting on a regular camera, you definitely invest in a tripod. It is a major help in terms of just keeping the composition nice and clean. And again, finding those straight lines and the straight verticals. A tripod is immeasurable in helping with that. And I've probably harped on this more than I thought I did in the talk, but I'm a big proponent of making sure things are really square. It really does go a long way in terms of making the image look more professional and more finished if you just kind of correct for those distortions. I've seen a lot of submissions, like sitting on juries and stuff over the years, where things are just looking really crooked, and it just detracts from the finished quality of what's there. So
do you have any recommendations on tripods for cell phones?
No, I'm sorry, I don't, because I as I say, I don't use my cell phone in that way, so I'm not really sure what's available.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So Michael, your question?
Yeah, I have a question here. It was, any tips on reflective work, i.e. gold leaf or metal surfaces? And I might expand that to maybe glass, because that's something that's really common with fine art as well.
Yes. Major headache, frankly, in terms of glazing is a big issue, and then any really shiny work or anything with gold leaf, metallics, mirror, those are all a challenge. The best I can suggest is try to improvise something in those cases. So when I'm photographing a lot of glazed work, I actually have a full setup that I will bring with me. I shoot everything on location. I don't have a studio. So when I go to shoot, I'm basically bringing a studio with me. If I am shooting glazed work, then I'm usually bringing a big blind with me. And it's like large fabric panels with stands. And I actually basically set up a black backdrop that I'm poking my camera through to take the picture. And then by doing so, that black environment is killing all the reflections in the glazing. With gold leaf or any really shiny surface, that's a little bit more involved in terms of figuring out how you want those reflections to work, because if you set up a black backing to shoot through for, say, gold leaf, then the gold leaf doesn't look gold anymore. It starts to look really dark and brown. So that gets more involved. Oftentimes you may want to actually shoot through a white surface, because then the white reflection on the gold leaf will make it sparkle a little more. Or I actually often combine situations. So I will shoot it with lights in one place and through a different blind with another, and then actually combine those photos in editing to kind of selectively capture the gold leaf elements that are reflective, and then not the rest of the image that maybe I didn't want lit that way. So that becomes more a much more involved editing process to deal with those. It is possible, but as I say, you have to, it's a little more of a setup to deal with that.
So my question is, somebody has a question about a digital SLR lens. What would you recommend if you're shooting really large 2D work? What would you recommend?
That's a little tricky too. It really depends on the camera. The biggest factor is how much space you have. So it's the further away you can get back from work, the better in general. If you have to be really close, as I was trying to show with the cell phone camera, if you have to get really close, then you are using a much wider lens, which also introduces more distortion and is more of a challenge. So if you have a space that you can back up in, you can use a longer lens that is less distorted and looks better in general. That being said, yeah, it really a lot of it comes down to the camera and then situation. So I have about, I think, 8 lenses in my kit that I will swap as needed. The one that I use the most is a 65mm lens. That is a bit long, but it is also very sharp and very little distortion in it. If I'm working on a really big piece, then I will use maybe a 35mm lens, because I may just not have the room to back up to see that whole thing. And otherwise, the standard approach is to get a zoom lens that has some range. If you are going to document a lot of work, I would recommend investing a little more in the quality of the lens. So the downside with the really inexpensive consumer lenses is that they tend to distort a lot more. So they're very versatile, they're very inexpensive, but there's a reason that they're very inexpensive, and that is the quality of the glass in the lens is not as good. It will tend to introduce a lot more shape distortion, especially as you get closer to something. The edges will curve a lot more, and it's just more involved to kind of fix all that stuff later. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have a question about lighting here, one from Tammy, and then a follow-up from Julie. Any recommendations for better lights than the dollar store LEDs? And then Julie would also like to add, and what bulb temperature? Warm white, cool white, or daylight? So it's a two-parter.
Okay. The lighting, again, a little tricky. There's a huge range of stuff that's available. The gold standard is to use strobes. Not advocating for that. I have about $6,000 in strobes that I use between two locations. Strobes will give you the best color temperature, the best rendition, will put out a lot of light, so it gives you a lot of control. If you're working, I'd say if you have a sort of moderate budget, then you could get speed lights, so like flash heads. Again, there's lots of options on Amazon. I'm not trying to be a proponent for Amazon, but it's very convenient for this kind of thing nowadays. So there is a lot of, frankly, Chinese manufacturers that have produced a lot of photo equipment lately and made it quite accessible online. So small speed lights, flash heads are basically mini strobes. They'll give you a lot of light and relatively good quality and not too expensive. A little more involved again in terms of how to set them up. Barring that, bright white LEDs, the brightest you can get, the better, because you want more light that you can then control. If you're stuck with a very low amount of light, harder to get decent photographs out of it. One other option that I occasionally use for paintings is called a total light, TOTA. Total lights are actually used as sort of fill lights in the movie industry, but they can be convenient for this kind of thing. They're super bright halogen lights, like 500 watt halogen, so they're very bright. The downside is they're very hot. Like you have to wear work gloves after they've been on for a few minutes because they get so hot. And the color rendition out of halogen lights is not as good. Strobes, again, is kind of the best standard. Which leads into the question about color temperature. Daylight is sort of the goal if you can get it. But if you're white balancing things, it's not as big an issue. It will the color temperature does shift the color. The light temperature will shift the colors a little bit in a work. In terms of if you're looking at something under yellow lighting, like warm lighting, the colors will feel very differently under daylight or under cool light. You try to compensate for that with the camera as best you can by white balancing or using a color reference. But if you're just buying lights, then I would recommend getting daylight, because that will be give you the truest rendition of the colors. It may not be the colors that you see in the gallery again, because galleries have there's a crazy array of lighting that goes in galleries. It's a kind of astounding what is used in different spaces, sometimes in the same space, but yeah, get daylight if you can.
Great. Yeah, thank you for answering that. Chris, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, so this one, Michael, is going to be and Blaine, this is going to be one about commercial rates, how you charge, how commercial photographers charge. The question was kind of like day rate or by piece. How do you like to charge? What's best for you and what's best for the artist? If I was going to hire somebody?
This is actually something that's being discussed amongst a few of us who specialize in art documentation lately. I have colleagues in Vancouver that we've focused on this for years. I've been doing this since 2006. So, and it has varied quite a bit. It's not an easy question to answer because we're trying to kind of formalize things. I have traditionally worked by an hourly rate, occasionally going into a day rate depending on the project. If you were looking to do this on a long-term basis, then I'd also recommend putting in a minimum, because if you're walking into something that only takes you 15 minutes to shoot it, that's great, but you have to consider all of the overhead that goes onto that as well. So yeah, I typically charge by the hour for the photography and then at a separate rate for post-production, which is all the editing process, which is usually like for installation photography, that's often 4 times as long as the photography itself is just in the editing. So you have to allow for that too in charging. And then traditionally, I've also extended a discount to artists. Like being an artist myself, I understand that art is not a big money maker. So I usually discount my rates a little bit for when I'm shooting for an artist as opposed to an institution or something commercial. But yeah, and then in terms of what those rates should be, that's also an area of debate that different people follow. Yeah, not easy to answer. I guess typical range nowadays is around $150 to $300 per hour for photography. And then the editing process, again, typical range is anywhere from about $50 to $150 an hour for the editing, depending on the photographer and how they set up the price structure.
Thank you. That kind of gives us something to kind of go on. I really think that every time I watch you, I do learn something more, and I do learn a few more tricks of things that I'm not doing right that I might be able to do that are kind of simple enough to do. And I mean, today, you know, using things like the grids, these sorts of things really, really, really help people on that kind of white balance, something that's so easy to do on a little piece. So I really appreciated this, Blaine. So thank you very much. Michael, do you have anything to add?
My pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, no, just thank you so much, Blaine. This is truly fantastic. And I also want to thank everyone for being on this call, and also a big shout out to Chris and Helen, who is behind the scenes. So thank you so much, everyone. Blaine, do you have anything else you want to say?
I was just going to throw it. I just uploaded the PDF again for anybody who might have missed it. Yeah, and if you run into any issues, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. And I'll just remind people that CARFAC and the AGA have been partnering on these fabulous professional development workshops. And if you have any suggestions for the next one, you can just email me or put it in the chat. But that's it for us. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.